he, perhaps more than any other, shaped the French language and made it a language fit for the expression of glorious theological ideas more than any other person. Theology and law, Latin and Greek. Greek's important because that's the language of the New Testament. Receiving his licentiate in law in 1532, Calvin was about 23, at his own expense, then Calvin published his first book, a commentary on Seneca's De Clementia, on clemency or mercy. The ironic thing is that Seneca, who wrote this book on mercy, was the tutor to the young Nero. Nero on clemency, he obviously didn't learn his lessons too well. Calvin comments on this book, and in commenting on Seneca's De Clementia, this 23-year-old is showing his knowledge of ancient literature, ethics or morality, rhetoric, the art of writing well, and philosophy, all subjects which will be of service to him in his later ministry. And running through the whole commentary, again, is his superb grasp of Latin. And it's striking that the first book which he wrote is a commentary on a text. This is what Seneca wrote, and this is what Seneca means. Here's these words, this is the idea, this is the flow of his argument. And this, of course, will serve his labours, prodigious labours, as a Bible commentator, and will give him the material for his preaching and for his theological writings. And throughout his university training, Calvin is engaged in long and intense study. Some might even argue that he studied too hard, because this damaged his health and he suffered for it, especially later, as we'll see next week in our lecture. John Owen, the Welshman working in England, is similar in this regard. But again, God is preparing Calvin through arduous study for his battle for the Reformation. This brings us to Calvin's conversion. We have an account of it in one of the few places where Calvin, a man very reticent to speak of himself, in one of the few places where Calvin opens up somewhat. Luther, we would say, wore his heart on his sleeve. He would tell you what he was thinking, where he was coming from, his personal life and history. Calvin shies away from all that. But he does give us an insight into his early life in his preface to this commentary on the Psalms. And he does that with a purpose. He wants to show by this that he is able to comment on the Psalms because he has had experiences like David of suffering. And so he can enter into the spirit of the book of Psalms. I quote Calvin: "Since I was too obstinately devoted to the superstitions of popery to be easily extricated from so profound an abyss of mire, God, by a sudden conversion, subdued and brought my mind to a teachable frame, which was more hardened in such matters than might have been expected from one of my early period of life. Having thus received some taste and knowledge of true godliness, I was immediately inflamed with so intense a desire to make progress therein." And this zeal in Calvin to grow after his conversion reminds me of St. Patrick, the apostle to the Irish, who speaks of this in his confession. Now, this brief extract does not tell us when Calvin was converted. From other considerations, probably about 1532 or 1533. As to where, we don't know, but somewhere in France. We don't even know who was instrumental in his conversion. One possibility is his cousin, Pierre Olevetan, who translated the Bible into French. We do know, though, the sheer fact of Calvin's conversion and the enormous fruit which resulted from it. We next see Calvin in November of 1533 having to flee Paris. On the 1st of that month, his friend Nicolas Cop, who had been made rector of Paris University, quite some office, delivered his inaugural address on the need for reform and renewal in the Roman Catholic Church. Brave man. The theological faculty was disgusted at Cop's oration, declaring it heretical, and Cop flees the city. Many people thought, and they may have been right, and many people, perhaps even most people today, agree, that John Calvin has a hand in writing Nicolas Cop's speech. Calvin, sensing the way the wind was blowing, flees Paris too. He was lowered by sheets out of a window and left the French capital disguised as a manual labourer. A bit like Paul's escape from Damascus when he was let down by the city wall in a basket in Acts chapter 9. Having fled Paris, for the next several months we see Calvin on the move through various parts of France. He has two parties hot on his heels. His enemies are after him, and so are his new friends. The new friends are very keen to track Calvin down because they understand that this young man, and this very new convert, has a profound understanding of God's Word. We do not have instituted churches or trained pastors of our own. This is a man who can lead us and guide us from the Scriptures. So they sought him for advice and spiritual guidance. Some of these people who sought Calvin and found him, some of them, especially ones who lived in Paris, would later die in the flames at the stake. And in this time of moving around France, keeping on the run, one particular shelter for Calvin should be mentioned. Calvin's stay with an affluent friend, Louis du Tillet of Angoulême in western France. Staying with the du Tillets, Calvin had access to Louis's father's library of 3,000 or 4,000 volumes. In those days, there were very few people in France with a library in their home of 3,000 to 4,000 books. And no doubt while there, Calvin availed himself of that fine library, and much of what he gleaned would later go into Calvin's first edition of his Institutes in 1536. This time of moving around France also saw Calvin visit Margaret of Navarre at Nerac. And Margaret of Navarre was King Francis I, his sister. And she was evangelically inclined. She lent an ear to the humanists, the scholars that were disagreeing with Rome on various fronts, and the reformers. And at the residence of Margaret of Navarre, Calvin also met a man called Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples, a great scholar who was also evangelically inclined and who saw, round about the same time as Luther, that the Bible taught justification by faith alone. But he never came out of the Church of Rome because he wasn't made of the same stuff as Luther. We'll mention these people again next week. And then came the famous affair of the Placards, which really brought things to the head. The affair of the tracts, or the gospel pamphlets, we would say. That took place in October 1534. Some very well organized Protestant pamphleteers produced tracts and had them distributed in one night in many parts of Paris and other parts of